It's my pleasure today to be joined by James Nixey, who was lead at the Russia-Eurasia programme at Chatham House. His principal expertise concerns the relationships between Russia and other post-Soviet states. He's published papers, articles, books, and journals, and extensive commentary in the national and global media. He has recently left Chatham House. I'm not to say he is unshackled by that, but I think it's the whole purpose of this conversation is to review back where we are with Russia, where we may end up with Russia, and how we got to this place. And in particular, how potentially some people got it so catastrophically wrong. I'm delighted to say that Chatham House is not included in that list because many of the Chatham House experts have been saying for years what a threat revanchist Russia posed. So I think this is going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. There will be all the links to James's social profiles and writings that you can sort of look into if you are so minded to do so in the description of this video. Before we jump in, I want to say a quick thank you as well to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Of course, your support is absolutely essential and very much appreciated, especially as we're planning the next trip to Ukraine next week to record interviews at the Brave One conference. All these things do cost quite a bit of money, so it is only through your generosity that we can make these kind of things happen. James, welcome back. I should say this is the second time you've been on.
Jonathan, it's such a pleasure to be here. Now, if I may return the compliment, but as the Russians used to say, it's not a compliment, it's a fact. Then, kudos to you and everything you have achieved on this podcast, which performs an invaluable service. So thanks for having me.
Yes, I mean it's both a pleasure and a duty. It doesn't always feel like a pleasure, but it is always a duty to
I
do that,
understand.
especially when you talk to Ukrainians. And I think you realise that we're not under missile fire, we're not in trenches, we're not bleeding out to protect the edge of democratic Europe. And I think that's always at the back of my mind, at least.
I completely agree. I mean, we may be bleeding out politically in this country and in Western Europe and the West more broadly, but yeah, it's nothing compared to what the Ukrainians are going through and have been going through for I think about 1,290 odd days now. And it behoves us to remember that, and I think that we do. We do our best within the limited means available, whether that's broadcasting or publishing, whether that's with institutions or outside of them. And I suppose we all have to hope that cumulatively every little helps for the right outcome at the end of the day. But I'm afraid it's still the battle's still being fought, literally and more sort of metaphysically. And I guess that's why we're still in it because we the Russians are in it to win it, quite frankly, and so therefore so must we be. So we all do our bit in our respective ways.
That's a crucial idea as well, isn't it? Because I'm not sure the full extent of what winning means from a Russian perspective. I'm not sure many of our leaders have really grappled with the full extent of what that actually means, and therefore what response we need to provide to it. In the Cold War, it seemed pretty clear that was we were defending against an entity that wanted to export Marxist-Leninism and topple every world government and sort of convert it into their pattern of governance and ideology. Have we fully defined what it is that Russia wants through this aggression, including hybrid as well as direct aggression?
Mhm.
Does Russia itself know what it wants?
It is a slightly age-old question, but of course an extremely important one because if you don't know what your adversary wants, then it's very hard to combat it. So it's important to keep on it. I tend to think of it a little bit like Trotsky. So Trotsky had the idea of eternal revolution, that it never stops. So you're constantly not just evolving, but revolutionizing, and that there was no end in sight. And I slightly think of that as Russia. I don't think that there is a sort of a folder in the Kremlin which marks how has inside it an end point to Russia's campaign, not just in Ukraine, but its global campaign to be a great power, if you like. And so I think we obviously to a certain extent we're searching for something that isn't quite there, but equally I think we can be assured that what Russia has at the moment isn't anywhere near what it is that it does want. So for it to be satisfied, as I say, that to say it will be satisfied would be contradicting my previous statement, because it will never be satisfied. But even if you take, even for a sort of a temporary pause, if you like, or a medium-term pause, I think that Russia, having still having not really taken even 1% of Ukraine in the last year, is clearly not there. I mean, I think probably from a personal survival point of view, Putin realizes he couldn't get away with it if he were to stop now at the behest of Donald Trump or popular behest or in anything like that. So, because I don't think his elites, never mind the population, would allow that. Putin I've always regarded as, of course, the lead figure, the culprit, or anything you want to go. Of course, himself a fanatical ultra-nationalist, but at the same time, he is also a clan manager, and he has to manage the ambitions and almost pathological desires of many people in his coterie, some of whom are probably, crazy as it may sound to say, even more megalomaniacal than we often think he might be. So anyway, this is dancing around your question, but I would say that there's some baseline important facts here. One of which is that territory is not really the main point as much as control is. So while Ukraine has control of itself, its foreign policy, its military, then that is absolutely unacceptable to Russia, and we mustn't fool ourselves into listening to Vladimir Putin on TV. I think it was last week, saying, "Well, we've never had any problem with Ukraine going into the EU." I mean, that's clearly false. We know, after all, that is exactly what.
Well, that's what caused it all.
That's what caused it all in 2014,
yeah.
precisely, the DCFTA, exactly. So one needs to sort of separate out the wheat from the chaff in Russia's statements, but also take heed of Russia's statements. And I still go back a lot to the November and December treaties. I think of them as ultimata, which did indeed demand of not just of Ukraine but of NATO a fallback to 20th century positions, quite frankly, not even 2014, things that actually were in nobody's gift to give to Russia, not Ukraine, not NATO, not the US. So what Russia wants is exactly that. It's not in any single entity or power's gift to give. And that's partially why we're still fighting on, obviously because of Ukraine and its perseverance and bravery and skill set, absolutely. But partly because it's simply not possible to actually give. Russia's demands are so outrageous that it's simply important. And this is something that Trump has found. He thought that he could do anything with executive power, and he can do more with executive power than any other president, because he doesn't really understand the three branches of government, or he ramroads over them. But even he has found that there is a limit to what the US is able to do. Not just with the whole, I'll solve it in day one, and it's we're already 6-7 months in, but simply because it's beyond Western power, and that does point back to the battlefield. Is the diplomatic momentum is at odds with the battlefield position. The battlefield position doesn't give rise to any end to this. So that's why it's so starkly in contrast with what all politicians are saying, really.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. Then something curious, I mean, this isn't a question I plan to ask. Now he's in power, does he perhaps not realize that there may be some advantage to the war not being resolved? There may be some personal advantage, maybe some political advantage, actually, to a less stable world, one where four key figures, three or four key figures in the world who see the world through not the sort of legal instruments of power, but through the exercise of informal personal power, as well as by extension having various agreements at self-enrichment and, as you say, clan enrichment. He may now see that actually this is an opportunity.
Sorry, I mean, I genuinely, I'm genuinely wondering if you're talking about Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin when you said he.
Well, both,
Yeah,
both. I
right.
mean, Putin's always known this,
Yeah,
but
the
this may
reason I
have
wonder is
dawned on Trump since he's come to office.
yeah, but you understand my confusion because, in fact, they do, it would appear, hold many of the many similar characteristics. I mean, despite their radically different upbringings, businessman versus KGB operative. Then, in fact, I've certainly always tended to the theory that these people do see the world in 19th century terms. Of concert of great powers is how it should be run. The little countries don't matter. We can act like grown-ups and get this done. Lines in the sand, whatever you want to say. And I think that does work for both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Obviously, Donald Trump is more constrained. I mean, having not to contradict what I said earlier, than Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is pretty close to being, I think, a totalitarian dictator now. I mean, we can caveat it if we want to. We can go into that, but now that's not true for America, even if it's displaying those tendencies and those signals and those indicators, which is extremely worrying and frankly worry what would never be. And not least because, of course, in the US, and we shouldn't do too much US analysis, but I would just say because I think none of us realized, or few of us realized, the extent to which the US elite, particularly the Republican elite, would kowtow to this. I mean, that is what has given Donald Trump his extra powers, his ability, because no one has effectively challenged him within his own party. Anyway, I think, these two leaders would, if it was down to them, and thank heavens it's not, would indeed have sorted it out by now if they could have done. But it shows that small states, middle powers, institutions, ineffective as we often are, cumulatively do actually hold some weight. And we have actually enabled this to not be sorted out unjustly as it would have done with those two had they been given free rein.
And I think we speculated about that with some of your colleagues that we were looking at a a Molotov-Ribbentrop type pact, especially when the minerals agreement came up. The real fear was they're simply going to, carve Ukraine up in some fashion with complete disregard. Russia, in some ways, has achieved a victory. I mean, on the battlefield, obviously, we look at it, we see it as a catastrophic loss. Of course, they're not accounting the human lives and material in the same way that we would. But when you describe the US essentially moving towards Russia's worldview, yes, they want to control certain things, and if territories are demonstratively, ignoring or going in opposition to what Moscow wants, they'll
Mm.
try to control them in a more brutal fashion, like
Yeah.
Ukraine. But essentially, what they want to seem to do is to export their DNA, export their concept of how the world works, which is these informal power networks, with intelligence service mafia type roots. And in some ways, that is the biggest triumph here, in that the world is moving towards these principles to a sort of Ruski Mir in that sense.
Yeah, I mean that is true. So there's two things there. I mean, first of all, I agree with that entirely. And Russia must be delighted at the way the world is going. I mean, when you think of it, that fewer people live under democratic forms of government now than at any point since the 1970s. I mean, it is quite remarkable. And obviously, the rise of social media has had something to do with that. There's a certain correlation of the rise of that, and especially with the rise of bots and the amplification of the amplification disinformation. So that's one thing. But I was writing it down, and I've forgotten what I was going to say. In addition, yes, I know. Russia has also made itself. The other victory for Russia, which I think is undisputed, is that Russia has made itself relevant. I don't mean relevant in the sense of important or a great power, but Russia hates being ignored, and we can't afford to ignore Russia. And in that sense, Russia has achieved its aims. It does not want to be the gas station that John McCain called it. It does not want to be one voice amongst many. It wants to be a sort of a lone, singular, distinctive voice, no matter what moral vacuousness that comes with that. And so I think that to have gotten so much of the Western world thinking about Russia and concerned about Russia is in itself a victory for Russia. And because I think probably if you think back to the early 2000s and the 1990s, we were perhaps stupidly, but relieved that we didn't have to think about Russia. I mean, this was a mistake, of course, think about Russia too much. And I suppose Vladimir Putin's contribution, I use the word advisedly, has been to force Russia to being sort of upfront and personal on the world stage, and I suppose to put it more grossly or more bluntly, to make it feared again. It was not feared in the 1990s; it was ridiculed, and Putin turned that around pretty damn quickly. Within the first 5 years of his presidency, with a combination of aggressive moves, firstly in Chechnya, of course, and then we can go on from there. So I think you're absolutely right in what you say about the way in which Russia's model has been sort of assumed. Anywhere from Hungary to Georgia, even I'm sorry to say recently, but it's put itself up there and in ways in which would please Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that Russia at the same time does not look as healthy as China or even the US by standards. I mean, economically, it's nowhere near, of course.
And of course, it's gone from 2007, where you had, I would say, almost a triumphalist Europe,
Yeah,
exuding sort of end of history vibes at
yeah,
the 2007 Munich
yep,
Security Summit. So when Putin pops up
yep,
and demands attention like a sort of petulant psychopathic toddler,
yep,
he's laughed at.
yep.
I think at that moment it must have sealed his determination to wipe the smiles off their faces. And then fast forward to last week, where you have European leaders, I would say, cowering in the White House, cowering before Trump. And Europe is, to an extent, despite its extraordinary economic strength, cowering in fear treading on eggshells around what Russia might do if we push back and exert our, not just our rights, but our values.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that a lot of, our ineffectiveness as far as Russia policy is concerned, the fact that we have let this happen, which I think is a fair statement, although we can drill into it again, is down to fear. Again, fear of a bear, just to put it in those gross terms again. I encountered it in the US 2 years ago, and I went there with colleagues, and we had some access into some quite interesting places inside the US government, including the Pentagon, and it was quite clear from what they were saying that the Russian threats had infected them. And when you take that back to I suppose if you are, how do I put this? If it's your job to be in charge of global stability, to ensure that the planet doesn't sort of mutually self-destruct, then you're going to be very risk averse to dealing with Russia, which holds half of the world's nuclear weapons almost. And if you take that view, I mean, it's reductive, but I'm just saying, if you do take that view, then you will do almost anything, including abase yourself effectively, which is in effect what has happened, more so in the Trump era, in order to prevent this from happening. And I suppose they
were already happening under Biden. I mean,
yeah,
Biden Sullivan was
absolutely was
exercised in abasement. Yes,
absolutely. Biden's prime objective was to not get involved and to not escalate. That was not for Ukraine to win. That was not his prime objective. It was to not get involved and not to escalate. And unfortunately, the Russians read that as weakness, as they so often and correctly do, and realized that it meant that they could push boundaries. I mean, in a literal and metaphorical sense, and I'm afraid we are paying the cost of that right now. And of course, nobody is saying that there is no risk. Of course, we are in an inherently risky situation here. Perhaps the most risky situation since at least '63 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think, as I say, the problem with that is that if you do it reductio ad absurdum, then you literally can't do anything that displeases the Russians, because they'll simply threaten to rain down, shock and awe firepower upon you, or with nuclear material inside it. So I think we need, whilst that has been resisted to an extent with the fact that we are supplying weapons and we do sanction Russia, then I think it does explain our reticence at doing all that we could have done. And I can't think of any other explanation, except perhaps for the corporate one, where people want to get back into doing business with Russia. That's in there as well somewhere.
Yeah. And doesn't it ignore maybe the two fundamental lessons of the Cold War and what we thought to be a victory? Although I have to say, sitting on the roof of MGO in 1992, I had the realization that Russia hadn't really realized they'd lost the Cold War, even though we were, bathing in the triumph of that. So that's when that phrase "można powtórzyć," we can repeat, first popped into my head, and I had a sense of absolute horror when I realized that was the case. There's two things I think we have not learned from the Cold War. One is that what preserves the peace is a reinforcement of boundaries. You actually make it absolutely clear what those boundaries are and your willingness to defend them to the absolute limit. And actually, Russia is a rational player, as Keir Giles often points out. It's rational and irrational at the same time, and they respect strength. The other one is the failure to really have a pre-postmodern sense that our values matter and that they're real. And a self-confidence. Those seem to be the two things, and one actually feeds off the other, because to defend your boundaries you need to have a certain belief of your own innate rightness. It seems that those two things are sort of lacking, both in policy but also in the moment in history we find ourselves.
Jonathan, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating, and I can only really agree and just emphasize your points rather than making new ones, because I think you've basically nailed it. I certainly agree that Russia, even if it didn't believe it had lost the Cold War, it was resentful that it had done. There's a certain nuance there potentially, and so and the fact that it had lost, and I suppose that it hadn't de-Sovietized de-Stalinized even, but certainly de-Sovietized. The fact that in a way that Germany denazified, or in a way that there were truth and reconciliation committees in anywhere from Ireland to South Africa, that sort of never happened. So that was a problem, and absolutely, it's our failure to enforce, it's certainly in a literal sense. I mean, I often think back to, even though it's not a Russia matter, to Barack Obama's laying down of red lines over Syria, and then the Syrians walking all over him, and then the Russians doing so as well. And so the failure to, I mean, it's one thing not to be clear and to give strategic ambiguity, but to be clear and then to not back it up, not to enforce it. Those sort of boundaries, as again, physical and literal and metaphorical, I think is absolutely there. And then I think we do doubt our own values these days, unfortunately. I mean, some of us don't. Some of us can be, are reasonably sure of our rightness. Although, as the headmaster of my child's school said the other day, a great deal of the suffering in the world is due to people being totally sure of themselves. And I understand, I agree with that. But at the same time, I also think that we need to have a bit more courage in our convictions. Weirdly, and this is going to sound a little shocking, but I also think we could learn a little bit from Donald Trump. I mean, he is able to do things, and he's invented this new kind of politics, which unfortunately he uses it for, he uses his powers for evil rather than for good, if you like, grossly put again. But in fact, I think that if we were to be a little bit more, or shall we say, a little bit less considerate of some of the boundaries with which we put down for ourselves, then that would enable us to go a little bit further. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of our inability to kick Hungary out of the European Union when it's so clearly in Russia's bed. These are things if we profess to have the values that if we made good on the values that we profess to have, I should say, then actually we would have done a much better job at, frankly, enforcing our own rules. But also sometimes in making some new ones. You and I in the green room, whatever the podcast equivalent of the green room is, we're talking about Russia's immobilized assets and whether they would ever go back. And again, that might require a change in the rules potentially, but then that is legitimate if the rules are no longer working. In the same way that even the U.S. Constitution has to be changed sometimes, even if infrequently over the years.
That's exactly it. And ultimately, Russia doesn't care about the rules; it cares about the actions. So if our rules get in the way of us taking action, Russia simply interprets that as extraordinary weakness.
Yeah.
Let's stick on the boundaries before we come to the other, probably most contentious topic, which is Russian culture. Let's stick with the boundaries idea, because if we continue to not imagine what Russia is fully capable of, or realize that it's not that they want something specific, but it's that the aggression, it's the challenge, is the reason. That is the core of the behaviors that we have to address, not try to rationally figure out what they might or might not want. They want us to be finished, essentially.
Yeah.
What other boundaries are going to be challenged? Because it strikes me in the interviews I've done, and of course, Keir could be seen on the absolute hawkish end, although given how often he's been proved right, I would call it the realistic middle. But it suggests to me that there's a considerable amount more challenge still to come. And we had Ursula von der Leyen's plane jammed. It's no big surprise to anyone who's been following the Baltic Jammer for a few years. But that was a very specific and intentional. You had European Bank of Reconstruction plus EU offices bombed in Kiev. You had a major US investment destroyed. You had the British Council hit. These, to me, seem like escalatory stepping stones towards first a sub-threshold and then a full Article 5 challenge. It seems to me that they're flexing their muscles, building up to ever-increasing set of challenges, which, if you ask Keir, I guess he'd say that fits in with the Russian MO. They're not going to just strike out if they don't know how we're going to respond, but they're going to perhaps test us on that route before the big blow comes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You and I are of one mind, as always, Jonathan. I mean, in terms of, you said they want us finished. It reminds me of, there was some joke, I can't quite remember it, of, you don't need to keep up with the Joneses. You've got to bring the Joneses down to your level, and that's basically what Russia does, because it can't compete on any level, technologically, demographically, economically, of course. And therefore, but it is doing a great job, and it goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. It's doing a pretty good job of not just of prizing open the fissures, pre-existing in Western civilization and society, but it's putting doubt and something more than doubt. It's something, a new nascent nationalism into more and more people's minds, and that is good. Even if it's a UK nationalism or a US nationalism, then that still works for Russia, because of course it does vehemently believe in that sort of in the supremacy of a state, and holds no truck for the pooling of sovereignty, which we were beginning to get into, but now seem to be verging away from. It is important, but although difficult, to imagine for us to keep imagining what Russia is capable of. I say it's difficult because, of course, when you do it, then people begin to think you're being you're scaremongering, or you're being a Cold War warrior, all those ridiculous tropes that we've heard over the years. But the reality is that if you look at it from just a slightly more telescopic distance viewpoint, then that is precisely what Russia has done. When you ledger down if we were to ledger out what Russia has done by 2025. Back in 2000 or in the 1990s, anybody looking at that future ledger would have thought that we're crazy. I mean, absolutely insane. How could Russia possibly do all of this? And I'm not just talking about the land grabs, but everything else as well. So it shouldn't be too much of a stretch for us to look into another 20 years in the future and imagine what else what else may come, and that surely has got to involve some form of muscular military action in a NATO state. And whilst, yes, I would accept the point that Russia has got its hands full in Ukraine and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, then obviously a pause in fighting by a premature political ceasefire will give it the chance to do that. And again, it's not that it will happen next month or even next year, but we have to look at these things in 5 and 10 year timeframes to really get a sense of it. And then it shouldn't be too difficult to imagine, and we shouldn't be being called as sort of fantasists or Russophobes, if we do that. I just wanted to say one thing, because you mentioned the Baltic plane jamming, because it reminded me of a discussion with a friend of mine who's a pilot, and he objects to the news stories on this as a pilot would, because he says, look, we can cope with it. It's not a problem. And I object to it because Russia's doing it. And I'm very glad he can cope as a pilot, and that's great. But as a Russia analyst, you've got to say that not only is he potentially taking some of those actions, taking some redundancy out of the system and just increasing ever so slightly the chances of a catastrophe, then so I accept my pilot friend's point of view that. And I'm sorry to go on about this. It's probably not the rabbit hole you wanted to go down, but it was. but I think that it's it does demand that it calls for good pilot skills and professionalism, as well as good Russia analytical skills, and then the understanding that they may come into tension. Just
because we can cope with paper maps doesn't mean that should go back to being the standard.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah,
and this is an interesting point, isn't it? People are thinking short term, as we tend to do in democracies, and even more so in the age of social media. But Russia, and especially China, think more long term, perhaps China far more strategically than Russia does.
Yep.
But there's a sort of clarity to the strategy there. The divide and conquer is a relentless mechanic. And we can see that unfolding in not just Eastern Europe, and we have to turn to Britain on that as well, is once you get governments like in Slovakia and Hungary that are prepared to show fealty to Moscow, they're prepared to import some of the toolkit of Russian authoritarianism and broker business deals. It's all part of the same thing. Degrade their legislators degrade or have a more authoritarian version of the executive, degrade their media, the independence of the judiciary, all this sort of toolkit of authoritarianism. The whole point there is if they can take governments out one by one through supporting this slide to authoritarianism, Europe becomes a mosaic of a mixture of, democratic values and those that are showing fealty to Moscow. Once it's a mosaic, then over the space of years, you can break that up. It may almost be like at some point they get enough of those to do a kind of Warsaw Pact where the compliant ones start to more aggressively take down those who are the holdouts. And my fear, and this is going to sound extremely paranoid to some, is that if Britain falls to reform,
Yeah.
then that is direct export of a Russian authoritarian toolkit right here in the Britain, without a doubt, is the strongest supporter of Ukraine, but could be taken out through its own internal weakness and blindness.
Yeah, you unfortunately stole my lunch there, Jonathan, because I mean I was going to say that, but of course what's happening in France right now as well is another example whereby the weakness of the French government could let in some of the more what we would consider to be extreme forces further, a long way either side of the middle. So I do think that we are facing this wider battle. The Russians would probably agree with that, by the way, that this is not just about Ukraine, and there is a wider war of the West. And that because Russia doesn't hold to liberal ideas and thinks that we are not just weak but also decadent, and that I think the phrase from Carl Bildt was something like Russia believes that we've got the guns, you've got the gays, and so it is, and it's beginning to capitalize on those sort of rather primeval or base sentiments that perhaps exist in humankind more broadly at some level, unless you have sort of had a sort of an infusion of liberalism in one way or another, which I guess you and I have, but is not true everywhere. Coming back to the issue of schools, whereby morality and ethics are not necessarily taught as perhaps they ought to be, or taught at all. But I'm not afraid of Europe being a mosaic, because in some ways that's part of its beauty. But I am concerned about our impotence in the face of blatant Trojan horses, whereby Russia is using, and it doesn't have to do it's not a great deal of effort on Russia's part, because it's got a willing vassal in the leaders of Slovakia and Hungary, to slowly, and this is where Russia maybe does have a little bit of patience. It's not normally known for its patience like China is, to just begin to inveigle itself into the workings of the EU and Western member state governments. I mean, I am with Keir, since you mentioned him, very much on my admiration for the frontline states, because they seem able, presumably through dint of history, to seal themselves off from any doubting Thomas ideas about the rightness of where they stand. They don't seem to have that diplomatic gene that this must be managed, or the corporate gene that there is more and more shareholder dividends to be made out there. That doesn't seem
Or
to
the
exist.
culture gene that
Yes,
sport and
we won't
culture and
get into that.
immune
We
from
can
politics. Like
absolutely
I'll
go
come
there.
to that
We mustn't
next.
do
Yeah.
that. So I think there was an article, I think it was written by Tuomas Ilves of Estonia, or I might be wrong, saying be more Baltic. I think was the article. I forget where it was published now. I'm sorry. And they do seem to me to hold a model, partly for how their societies are run, but really for just holding a line, having some principles for dealing with Russia, and then just obeying those principles rather than fudging it and letting things through and being a Swiss cheese.
Yeah, and Finland and even Sweden and
Yeah,
Denmark to an
yeah.
extent
It's the
seem to
arc across
demonstrate that.
exactly. There's an arc. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a curious resilience that also comes from those countries really being built on very poor quality soil, where they can't extract wealth from the ground and build these kind of authoritarian structures to profit from extracted wealth. They have to add value to material to become the sophisticated economies that they are. I think there's also something there in this sort of extractive politics, which corrupts absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, it takes a certain kind of person, I suppose. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, and I can't psychoanalyze what Orban has become. Although I realize he's gone on a journey. He wasn't always what he is now, which I think I wouldn't necessarily agree is the case with Vladimir Putin. I think he is what he was, which is a great power nationalist and a KGB operative, as I said. That I think Orban, however, has changed for reasons that honestly I lack the expertise on Hungary to really understand. But I'm aware that in his younger days, as an up and coming politician, he was quite pro-European and quite a modernizer, and so he has certainly changed, and is something to be aware of that people can go bad, if you like, and we've seen that in Mikhail Saakashvili, and there are other examples too. So that is true, that one mustn't place too much trust just because someone was started out okay, they can somehow they manage to atrophy. But so look, it's a complex situation in which it needs this sort of multi-layered, multi-patterned policy, because China is so different to, in every single sense, to some of the smaller states that we've just been talking about, and to Russia. And we do seem unable to turn on a dime, to sway with the evidence, as one should do. When the evidence changes, I change my mind. What do you do? That sort of thing. And I always remember the case of Georgia, whereby we carried on supporting Mikhail Saakashvili, obviously, as we should have done at the start from 2003 onwards, after the Rose Revolution. But we were unable to turn that around when he became increasingly demagogic, and that's obviously true. Now, it wasn't such a problem because Georgia's not in the EU, and we could sort of ignore it and kick the football away. But it's much harder to ignore here, and we don't have the necessary tools to do the appropriate thing, which we were able to do with Georgia. I ignore it. We can't ignore Hungary in the same way.
And of course, I'll just leave this hanging. I don't actually expect you to respond to this, but one of some people don't change. Some people are telling you who they are, and we ignore it at their peril. And one of Nigel Farage's school teachers in a report when he was exceedingly young described him as a Nazi. So
right, a lesson to us all then.
Yes. Let's turn to the culture one, because I think this idea that there are certain things that are off limits is actually quite interesting, because it comes back, I think, to the idea of privilege versus rights. Rights tend to be universal. Privilege is something people will irrationally defend. They think they're being rational, but they'll defend their privilege to the death. I think Russians generally defend privilege and have no concept of rights. But culture seems to fit into this. Culture, sport to an extent as well, which is don't politicize, don't take away this thing. And of course, those that are consuming, whether it be opera, and they've got the case of Nitrebka at the at the Royal Opera House, it's almost like they confuse the idea that somehow their consumption of culture is a universal human right, when it's not. It's a privilege, and they ignore the idea that not only is Russian culture weaponized, fully weaponized by the regime, always has been, perhaps slightly less so under late stage Tsarism, but certainly the Soviet Union weaponized it to an extraordinary degree, and we ignore that at our peril. And we were talking before we hit record, the journey I think that everyone who's been involved in Russia studies has been on in maybe not rereading everything, but going back and looking at things to say, okay, what did we miss about the weaponization and the imperial messaging that is imbued within Russian literature, for instance?
I mean, this is a super question, and something that I'd love to spend more time on, and to be a whole. You could do a whole. I'd love to see a whole event on this topic, because of course, it's hard for anybody of a liberal disposition, because most of us came to Russia through the culture in some way in the last century, and we weren't taught about it in the same way that we are now, with a sort of a postmodern eye. And so, that's why over my left shoulder, which looks like my right shoulder on a Zoom screen, there's the Dostoevskys and the Tolstoys from my earlier days, and so, you don't want to, one doesn't want to knock it, because obviously there is great writing, it has artistic merit, and that is beyond dispute. But at the same time, a closer reading does tell you about Dostoevsky's, belief in the specificity of a Russian soul, in Solzhenitsyn's idea that the Russian people are superior because they've suffered more. In Tolstoy is the same, Lermontov is the same. So all of the great Russian writers, frankly, all of the great Russian writers had a considerable degree of Russian nationalism inside them. Whilst it perhaps didn't take on the slightly more aggressive nature that we see in today's political leaders and commentators inside Russia, then it was always there, and so they have utilized this, they have weaponized it, as you say, and I'm afraid we can't get away now. We shouldn't get away. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't teach these things. That we shouldn't teach Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but I do think that we should teach them better. Because certainly in my own education, then there was no understanding of Ukrainian nationhood, or of Central Asia's distinctiveness, or the Muslim underbelly of Russia's south and the Caucasus. And
suppression of alternative literatures is a kind of interesting one. I mean, you look at I always think of it as this sort of, you look at this forest and the trees are very tall, and the reason they seem so tall is that everything around it has been cut down.
But I think I would sum it up by saying that we need to just avoid Russocentrism. The idea that Russia is the greatest and is centrifugal to all this, not least because it's historically inaccurate, because in fact, ironically, that is Ukraine, of course. And so one should continue to teach Russian history and culture, but I think we can just teach it better, and that will at least help, I think, in future generations, not to sort of idolize or deify or angelicize Russia, which I think I think I was guilty of it, and I was lucky enough to have an education at Chatham House, which taught me differently. And as my time at Chatham House, since you opened with it, it coincided with Putin's arrival as well. And that already he had been he had instigated the first wars in Chechnya, and then very soon after that you had closing down of TV stations, and you had the Kursk incident, which didn't put him in a good light, etc., etc., and that was all in 2000, right? So, in a sense, I guess I was lucky because those sorts of things were able to sort of change and mold me alongside some very good mentors, and so that was it. But not everyone has had that opportunity. Either they weren't around in 2000, and they didn't see it, or in the 1990s, or they didn't have the opportunities that are provided to some of us. And so it's understandable. So I guess it goes back to being, so education and university teaching ought to be a little bit better than it has been thus far, I'm afraid.
That's a great call to action there for anyone in the profession who's watching this, and hopefully a new generation will have a more sort of challenging perspective on these things. That's probably, we've covered so much fascinating territory, and so many, I think, interesting ideas have arisen in this. I probably should call a halt there. I'm sure we could keep talking for another couple of hours, but I think there's plenty of food for thought there for the audience.
Sport, but we'll do it next time.
Oh yeah, sport as an extension. I'm far less knowledgeable about sport, but yes, it's the same. It's the same sort of idea of privilege and the weaponization of power. In some ways, it's easier in sport, even easier.
Well, because not least because the Russians have been proven to be cheating at it. So
yes,
on a very base level as that.
Absolutely breaking the rules from the ground up. But also the extraordinary elitism, which Ukrainians would point out, which in the Soviet Union and modern Russia, that is indistinguishable from a tool of a regime, extension of power, projection of power.
Jonathan, thank you so much. I
Yes,
feel
it's been
really
a real
privileged.
pleasure.
It's ever so kind of you to invite me on when I'm no longer a sort of an institution person,
Oh,
an ex
even
person.
more interesting in
I
some
appreciate
respects. Yes.
it.
Thank you so much,
All the
and
very
I
best.
look forward to the next time. Thank you. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also, in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.